Good morning, everyone, and thank you, everyone, for being here extra early on a Monday morning. We don't have a quorum yet, but I want to get started so that we can hear some of the testimony on House File 2. Our agenda for today is first House File 2, and underneath Rule 7 of the committee rules, I'm going to set the time for consideration of House File 2 so that we are done with it no later than 11 o'clock. And that's the reason that we had the meeting early. For all my greater Minnesota compatriots and anyone else who had other plans this morning, thanks for coming in an extra 45 minutes early. We may, depending on how much progress we make on the budget forecast after 11 o'clock, come back sometime after session today to finish reviewing the budget forecast. Let me just, at that point, I'll make an announcement on the floor or at the end of the meeting today on what the timetable is for that. But just so people know, there's a possibility that we might be coming back after session to finish off the budget forecast. And with that, I see I've got a question. Representative Hillstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, there was a motion on the floor to send this bill back to the Civil Law Committee. Can you tell me what the path that you intend for this bill is? Do you intend to send it back to the Civil Law Committee, or should I ask all of my data practices questions here, Mr. Chair?
Representative Hillstrom, my understanding is that there's going to be an amendment that removes the language that would otherwise potentially mean that it has to go to the Civil Law Committee, and I believe after that amendment is acted on that there would be no need for it to go there. I guess you can ask the author of that, but I guess my understanding is, presuming that that amendment passes, that there'd be no question about whether it needs to go to civil law or not, and so then it would be my intent to move it to go back to the floor.
Mr. Chair.
Representative Hillstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just because you delete the data practices language from the bill doesn't mean it doesn't have data practices implications. And even if the amendment passes, there is significant data practices implications. So I'll just ask my questions here, Mr. Chair.
Well, and that's fine, Representative Hillstrom. I'd encourage you to then do that. Okay. Oh, okay. I understand we do have a quorum, so I'm going to officially convene the meeting, recognizing that there is a quorum, and we have the minutes of the January 26th meeting in front of us. Are there any corrections, additions, changes to those minutes? Representative Hamilton moves approval of the minutes. See no discussion. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion prevails. The minutes are approved. And with that, we have House File 2 before us. As I was saying, for those who maybe just came in the last minute or two, a couple of things. We're going to do House File 2 first, then we're going to take up the budget forecast. Depending on how long this all goes, it's possible that we may reconvene sometime after session tonight to finish discussion on the budget forecast. And I am, as I said when we first started the meeting, going to invoke Rule 7, giving us to 11 o'clock to consider House File 2. With that, Representative Loon, would you like to move House File 2?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I would move House File 2 to be considered and re-referred to the General Register.
Yes, Representative Loon moves that House File 2 be referred to the General Register. And Representative Loon, why don't you first describe the bill and then take your amendment that's got some of the civil law related language, and we can maybe talk about that. There may be questions about that. But why don't you first describe the bill briefly, Representative Loon?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. Very briefly, House File 2 makes some reforms, first of all, to the seniority-only policy when unrequested leave of absences or teacher layoffs occur. Currently, state language requires that seniority is the only factor considered unless there is a alternative locally negotiated plan in place. It would further direct that each plan be negotiated at the local school districts between the districts and their teachers unions, and that those negotiations would incorporate the statutory teacher evaluations as part of those factors, among other things that would be determined locally, which and also may include seniority. would prohibit placement of students in consecutive years in classrooms with ineffective teachers as determined by teacher evaluations, would strengthen and clarify the standards on new teacher licensure with regards to the academic skills test and making both the MTLE, or Minnesota Teacher Licensing Exams skills test a college level test and commensurate with similar score in ACT or SAT as the candidate prefers. Would also ask the Board of Teaching to continue and increase their efforts to allow licensure of quality teachers with out-of-state, holding out-of-state teachers' licenses and encourage their activities on regional reciprocity. Would, again, further direct them to continue clarifying and providing rules for their process of licensing teachers prepared through an alternative teaching program, and would empower school districts to tap community experts for vocational, technical, and career education programs after first attempting to find a licensed teacher, and would allow those local districts to grant those community expert waivers without first obtaining the permission of the Board of Teaching. And that, just very briefly, is an overview of the bill, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative Loon. Representative Loon, would you then like to move the A55 amendment?
I would, Mr. Chair, and I also have a memo that I would like the pages to distribute from Mr. Gehring from Nonpartisan House Research regards to this amendment and to the topic it pertains to.
Okay, I see the page is going to distribute that amendment. Thank you. And why don't you, as the, not the amendment, but as the memo is being distributed, why don't you talk a little bit about what the A55 amendment does?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Basically, the A55 amendment just removes, it references to the data practices clause that I think was causing some concern or confusion about whether or not this bill needed a referral to civil law. And again, in conferring with the chair of civil law and with Mr. Gehring, legislative analyst on this topic, really the language, we don't propose any changes to the classification of data in House File 2. It's neither the intent, my intent, or what we were trying to get at. It was merely referencing the current privacy standards for this data. And so it's really our feeling, and conferred with Mr. Gehring, that it's really not necessary. So we're deleting that reference in the bill. We do not propose any changes, again, to the data privacy. That remains as it is today. And so that is the amendment.
Okay, discussion to the amendment. Representative Hillstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Representative Loon, I see that you're removing the language that refers to the data practices, but I don't believe that you're removing the implications of the data practices law from your bill. So I really want to get a sense. So your bill requires that school districts post, or at least give this evaluation and rank teachers based on their effectiveness rating. So effectiveness rating then is private personnel data. So if you rank people according to their private personnel data, and someone with seniority ends up lower on the list than someone who isn't, who's new, haven't you just disclosed what kind of a teacher their teacher evaluation really says? Because you're saying that the teacher who has longer seniority is actually a worse teacher than the newer teacher. Isn't that actually disclosing their rankings and their evaluation?
Representative Loon.
Mr. Chair and Representative Hillstrom, no, that is not what the bill does. We do not require districts to rank or post rankings of their teachers as part of the negotiated ULA, or unrequested leave of absence process. What we do direct is that each district negotiate a process that teacher evaluations be part of that, among other factors, and I do not require or put a weighting to what that factor would be. So it would be one of many factors that a district could negotiate, and it would not provide for the public notification or provision of that information. All of those evaluations are private data, and they would continue to be, not, my bill would not change that.
Mr. Chair.
Representative Hillstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So Representative Loon, but if you and I are on the list and we both teach the same subject, and I'm ranked lower than you or higher than you, the two of us are going to want to know, what is it about your performance or my performance that puts you higher? So what am I going to be able to do, or what am I going to be able to get access to confirm that, in fact, you are a better teacher than I am? Or do I just have to sue to make sure that it's not favoritism, or to make sure that I'm not being laid off because I'm older, or I'm a woman, or my race?
Representative Loon.
Mr. Chair, Representative Hillstrom, yes, there is a process in the bill. If you are placed on unrequested leave and you feel that somehow you've been aggrieved in that process or in that decision-making, you can request a hearing, would be entitled to a hearing within 14 or 15 days, I believe it is in the bill. And, you could certainly challenge or have a review of your evaluation process to make sure that everything was done properly, but it would not entitle you to see private data on another teacher. Again, that remains private personnel data.
Mr. Chair.
Representative Hillstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, Representative Loon, that's kind of the point. If I can only get data on myself, and I can't get data on the teacher that I am competing with for a job, how can I confirm that, in fact, how that teacher was evaluated wasn't based on some other reason that we didn't negotiate? Because if it's private data, how can I confirm that the process is actually fair, and that, Representative, I want to make sure that teachers are not going to be placed in a situation where they can't confirm or deny whether or not they're being treated unfairly as they're being laid off. This really is a layoff bill, and I envision that the data practices challenges in this bill will result in lawsuits.
Representative Loon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, Representative Hillstrom, I appreciate your concerns, but again, we provide an additional layer of protections for teachers who want to challenge the decisions made, and all other grievance processes currently available to teachers would continue to exist. And a teacher could certainly take their complaint through the extent of all of the grievance processes available to them. And so there's nothing that takes away from teachers' rights in this. But again, the point I'm making in the bill and with this amendment is that I am not changing the privacy status of that personnel data in what I am providing in House File 2. And this amendment just clarifies that.
Say, committee members, let me just interrupt for a second. I think we're getting a little far afield from the A55 amendment, which just simply takes two references to Chapter 13 out of the bill. I think certainly there are legitimate issues that you're bringing up, Representative Hillstrom, about the bill. But I guess, does anyone have any particular questions to the A55 amendment as it is written that simply just takes out those two references in the bill to Chapter 13?
Mr. Chair.
Representative Hillstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, just because you take the words out of the bill doesn't mean that you don't still implicate Chapter 13. And so I really do have some additional Chapter 13 questions about which of this data actually is going to be private or public. This really is the kind of thing that should be heard in the Civil Law Committee as far as I'm concerned, Mr. Chair, but if this is my only place to do it, I believe that it's appropriate for me to do it here.
Okay, well, Representative Hillstrom, I'm not suggesting that you don't have a right to make another motion to send it to the Civil Law Committee or something like that, but I guess it seems to me that your questions are about a broader issue than just the simple A55 amendment that talks about removing those two references to Chapter 13.
Well, Mr. Chair, I'll wait till you remove them, then I'll ask my questions.
Okay. All right. Does anyone else have something specifically to the A55 amendment? If not, all in favor of adopting the A55 amendment, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
No.
Motion prevails. The A55 amendment is adopted. Okay. Members, let's, I want to call on Representative Mahoney here too. But the main reason that the bill is here before the committee is this issue of the fiscal effect, which I had actually not thought that it had any fiscal effect, and then we got a fiscal note shortly before the session last Thursday, and so we did call the bill back here to Ways and Means. Representative Loon made that motion. So I want to really spend, I think it's appropriate that we spend our time primarily on that fiscal issue. But let me just, I don't want in any sense cut anyone off. I guess Representative Hillstrom, let me go back to you if I can for one more question if you want, and then I'll go to Representative Mahoney. Representative Hillstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll just make this a quick couple-part question. You can answer it, and then you can come back to me later in the hearing. Representative Loon, so it doesn't say in your bill when evaluations must be done, when new evaluations must be done. And it doesn't necessarily say when these new lists or this information needs to be given out to teachers. So the question is, one, is when do you think that teachers should find out where they are on this list? Don't you think you should give some discretion on whether or not teachers can be evaluated based on old evaluations, or if everyone has to be based on the current year's evaluation done at the same time, so you're not measuring last year's evaluation versus this year's evaluation? And don't you think that teachers should have the opportunity to verify the information about where they fall on the list so that they can predict, kind of like now with seniority? I find out in the fall where I fall on the list, and if I have concerns, I have an opportunity to verify the information is accurate. Don't you think you leave an awful lot open in this bill that is going to result in lawsuits for school districts?
Representative Loon.
Mr. Chair and Representative Hillstrom, well, I'll start with your last question first and work my way back a little bit. No, actually, I don't, because, again, the evaluations are created at each school district level and have been created. We're in the first year of those evaluations being in place through negotiations with the teachers. And so the teachers and the administration have created these evaluations jointly. And that. So first of all, it's been a collaborative, cooperative process to create the evaluations. And secondly, the evaluations are to be conducted annually with a 3-year summative evaluation occurring. And so in the third year, we're in the first year. So in the third year, there will be a summative evaluation done on each teacher. And so, and this legislation would not take effect until after that has occurred. So basically, in the fourth year from now. So all of that information will have been gathered. Those evaluations will be done. And again, it is a very engaging process, if you will, between teachers, between peer mentors and coaches and administrators and that to create these evaluations. So I think, again, the process will be one that is of not of a contentious nature. In I think almost any case, this is something that is being done cooperatively. And we heard testimony and comments from some of the members of my committee who are teachers who had nothing but good things to say about. They've been through their own first year of evaluations, that this is a great thing. And so with that, I'm sorry, getting back to your other question, the bill does not ask school districts to put together a ranking of their teachers according to their evaluations. It's asking the districts to negotiate a process that would be followed in the instance of an unrequested leave of absence. That would be something that would be other than seniority only. It would ask that the evaluations be part of that, and any other factors that are negotiated between the union and the administrators or the school board in this process. So again, I think you're presuming a process that is not called for in the bill.
Okay, I'm going to recognize Representative Mahoney for a question, then I want to get on with the whole discussion of the fiscal note and the fiscal implications of the bill, which is really the reason why the bill is before us today. Representative Mahoney.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I now have two questions, because I keep hearing this unrequested leave of absence. Is that what you're calling the layoffs now, is an unrequested leave of absence?
Representative Loon.
Mr. Chair and Representative Mahoney, well, I believe that's how they're referred to when a district goes about it, but yeah, it's the same thing.
Okay.
To
Representative Mahoney.
layman, it's a layoff, yes.
Thank you. I always just got a layoff. No, just got my check at the end of the day when I got laid off, and it's like, here, you're laid off. It's always honesty. Honesty is good. I'm not a lawyer. I get to play one every once in a while on TV around here. But I do know this, that if I'm laid off and there's a process, I want to know how that process happened. And kind of back to what Representative Hillstrom was talking about, I want to see all the evaluations. I want all the, the data that was not shared with me to come up with this evaluation or ranking. And I'm going to hire a lawyer, and I'm going to say, I want you to get all that information. I want to know who's talking about me, saying what, and how they're saying it, and how they're writing it. And that lawyer is going to charge me $250 or $300 an hour. And the school district is going to have to come up with all that data. I know from a number of areas that the lawyers always have to go over that data before it's released. So when these data requests are made by the laid-off teacher, the school district's going to have to pay for that, correct?
Representative Loon.
Mr. Chair and Representative Mahoney, well, if you're talking about requesting a hearing to go over a decision that was made affecting you that you disagree with, yes, the district would, likely bear the cost of that hearing, yes.
Okay,
So-
Representative Mahoney, last question.
So kind of that's one part of that question. But then the 14-day appeal, which I heard you talk about, 14 or 15-day appeal time, we don't, things don't move as quickly as we sometimes want them to. So this could, 14 days, you can't get an attorney to write the letter within 10 days. So is there a process in your bill that allows for, extending that 14 days? Because frankly, this is easily, I could see a 30 or 60-day process just to get the information, go over it, and come up with some kind of defense. I mean, I had to go through one of the credit rating agencies to correct one of their dumb mistakes, and that took like 9 months. I can't imagine this is going to be any simpler. So is there a process that once a request has been made by a laid-off teacher, and, that 14 days goes farther, to extend that out?
Representative Loon.
Mr. Chair, well, Representative Mahoney, there's nothing specifically in this bill that addresses that, just that if, as an aggrieved teacher, if you disagree with the decision that negatively impacts you, you have the right to ask for a hearing, and that hearing must be initiated within, again, I believe it's 14 days. I have to go back and it's either 14 or 15 in the bill. And as part of the process that is to be negotiated, there's to be a mutually agreed upon list of hearing officers that both the union and the district had agreed to that would be in existence to help facilitate that quicker process, if you will, if someone is to bring a grievance.
Okay, well, members, as I mentioned, I want to get on with the discussion of the fiscal implications of the bill, which is why the bill is here today. And I guess let me just say at the outset that it wasn't my desire to try to route a bill that I thought had fiscal implications around the Ways and Means Committee. When I looked at the bill, I genuinely didn't think that there were any fiscal implications to the bill. I would mention that back in 2014, I guess I found that Representative Mariani authored House File 2397, and there were requirements in the Board of Teaching there to adopt rules on continuing education requirements, adopt rules allowing for teacher licensure candidates to demonstrate attainment of various academic skills, and required the boards redesign rules to create flexible, specialized teaching licenses and other things. And so this bill House File 2397 in 2014, never had a fiscal note requested, was never called to the Ways and Means Committee, yet it seems to be in some ways fairly similar to what I thought we had here. But I also don't want to, in any sense, be accused of somehow breaking the rules, and so I, after being confronted with a fiscal note that showed a significant cost, even though I really doubted those costs myself, I thought it was appropriate to bring the bill here. And so what I'd like to do is, we've had a lot of discussions about this. Normally, what would happen in a case like this, if we had more time, is we'd go to the department and we'd say, Department, MMB, we really wonder about this note. How'd you come up with these numbers? And, you know, there'd be some discussion, and maybe they would say, okay, you've convinced us it really is a zero note, or maybe we'd say, oh, well, I guess you've convinced us. I guess maybe there's cost here and we didn't think there was. But just given the timetable and when we got the fiscal note a few hours before the time when the bill was supposed to be on the floor, we really didn't have time to do that, so we called it back to Ways and Means. But I'd like to have Melissa Johnson, who's our nonpartisan fiscal analyst that handles these kind of issues, to come forward and give us her thoughts on why, I guess, some of the concerns or questions she's got about the fiscal note that we got. And then I'll have someone from the department come forward, and they can respond to Ms. Johnson, and then we can ask some questions about that. So, Ms. Johnson, welcome to the Committee on Ways and Means.
Thank you. Mr. Chair and members, my name is Melissa Johnson, again with House Fiscal, and working in the Education Finance Committee. I put together a memo following the fiscal note being put out or being released, and kind of talk through some of the questions and concerns related to each section that had potential fiscal costs. And so I think that's being handed out as we speak right now. But I'll just speak briefly to the sections that had fiscal cost and kind of an analysis of what those fiscal costs might be or may not be. So the first section deals almost exclusively with the extent to which the Board of Teaching believes that it has to modify its rulemaking process in order to incorporate requirements of the bill. And it should be noted that the Board of Teaching overall has a general ongoing rulemaking authority, as outlined in Chapter 14 of Minnesota statutes. And to the extent that the legislature puts or requires that the Board of Teaching do significant revision to that rulemaking, it at times has provided an appropriation for that purpose. There are other times, however, when it's seen that it's because, especially with the Board of Teaching, because they have general ongoing rulemaking authority, that would be within the scope of their current responsibilities, and so there wouldn't be specifically fiscal costs that would be in addition. So it's kind of a difference of an opinion about how that goes about. And so in Section 1 of the bill, the Board of Teaching has indicated that they believe that they'll need a medium rulemaking authority to go through the process to address the Section 1 that relates to the out-of-state teacher candidates and rulemaking related to the alternative teacher prep programs. So that's a difference of opinion there. So like I mentioned, there has been in the past additional funding, but that is open to interpretation. It can either be absorbed by the agency, or it can be something that if the agency doesn't believe that it can handle those costs, it could be brought forward to the budget making committee during the budget making or the omnibus finance process. Any questions on that first section, Section 1?
Well, I think, Ms. Johnson, what I'd like you to do is go through your whole memo,
Okay.
and then we can have the department respond, and then we'll take questions.
Sure. Thank you. Mr. Chair and members, the next section that identifies fiscal cost is Section 4, and this is the section that relates to a alternative process by which teachers can apply for licensure, and it's called the licensure via portfolio. And this was originally put in place in 2008, and the provisions that are included in this bill, the department has identified significant costs related to IT to implement an online-based system. It should be noted that initially there was not an online-based system, so either between now and then it has moved to an online-based system, or that it's an ongoing cost that they have moved into. So that's something that needs to be addressed. And then they also believe that there's a cost of 1.5 FTEs in order to implement this, and they note that it's a new process. However, the process and the authority that they've had to do licensure by portfolio has been in place since 2000, in its current form since 2008. And Section 5 relates to the portion that is related to having the department and the Board of Teaching make arrangements or make agreements with other states to have easier transfer of licensure for teachers that are coming into the state. And so the department has identified a number of costs they believe that will be required of IT and also for travel and communications in order to be able to facilitate those agreements. However, a lot of the current information has already, or the requirements have already been in place since, I believe, 2011. And so those conversations and that communication is ongoing. So there's a question about whether that would be within the scope of the current responsibilities or something that's new due to this bill. Final section that I would speak to is Section 9, and this is the section for oversight of non-licensed community experts. And this section modifies the role that the Board of Teaching plays in this process, and instead of requiring that the Board of Teaching approve the variances, it now simply requires them to review those. And so however, the department believes there may be a cost of about a quarter-time FTE for this particular provision. There may be some question about whether that could be something, because they're no longer having to do all the extra process of having to actually doing the oversight, and instead are just in the position of being a reviewer. There's some question about whether there could be potential savings. So, but that's something that can be open discussion, and we definitely want to hear the perspective of the Board of Teaching on that.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Johnson. So that we're all fully informed with everything on this, I want to hear the department's view on this. And I understand that the executive budget officer who prepared the note is actually on jury duty today. But her supervisor is here, and if she could come forward to respond.
Mr. Chairman, while they're coming
Yes,
forward,
Representative Carlson.
there's a lot of discussion here about fiscal notes, and we have kind of an alternative memo here. I guess it's not a fiscal note under the law, but maybe if you or our chief fiscal analyst could explain to the committee, just as a reminder, what the process is and what the purpose of an official fiscal note is, and just how that works. You know, you and I have a history of being involved with kind of the behind-the-scenes part of it, as would any fiscal chair. But I think maybe before the department comes up, there should be an understanding of how that request comes about, what the process is, and why we refer to them as an official fiscal note, because I think when the amendment comes before us after the department done, that's going to be a big part of the discussion.
Okay, maybe I can ask our chief fiscal analyst, Mr. Marks, to respond.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair, Representative Carlson, members. We frequently get asked questions about fiscal notes, questions about numbers in the fiscal note, and is this legitimate, is this not legitimate? Typically, there's a little more time in the process than there was in this one, and so we would go back and work with MMB or with the agency and pursue those questions. The questions would be not unlike what's in this memo, raising these kind of questions and so on. And It's, as to how often, I don't know, maybe it happens on 10% of the fiscal notes or something like that. That's just a guess. But there are a number of fiscal notes where we get questions and pursue those. I'm aware of at least one other one this year where we've done that, and the fiscal note has actually been changed following that kind of discussion. So it's not it doesn't happen on a lot of them, but it's not unusual that we would do this sort of review.
Representative Carlson.
Mr. Chairman, my question was only, it really wasn't the memo of it in and of itself. I referenced it, but the process. If I were to ask you for a fiscal note, what would you tell me?
Mr. Marks.
Mr. Marks.
Mr. Chair, Representative Carlson, we'd look at the bill, and I'd suggest to you, yes, we should get a fiscal note on this, or no, this bill doesn't need a fiscal note, or in some cases, this bill needs a revenue estimate.
Could I ask for a fiscal note?
Mr. Chair,
Officially.
in Minnesota statutes 3.98, those who can request a fiscal note are the chair of the committee where the bill is in, or the chair of the Ways and Means Committee, or the like chairs in the Senate, or the chair of the Senate Finance Committee.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman,
Carlson.
what I was trying to do was get at the process, and a fiscal chair can ask for a fiscal note. No one in the minority can. So when I felt in my reading of the bill a fiscal note was needed, basically I had to go to you to request you to ask for a fiscal note. But just so people understand the process, then you request the fiscal note that goes to MMB. MMB then notifies the state agency that would be impacted, or agencies. In this case, it's two. Board of Teaching being separate from the Department of Ed, without even getting involved with a local impact statement. Then they prepare the fiscal note, and it's the expertise within the department that prepares an official note, but it has to go back to MMB for their review. And if MMB finds problems with the note, then it goes back to the state agency. So they respond to MMB's analysis, and then it would go back to MMB. But it's not an official fiscal note until it's signed off on by MMB. And I think it's important that people understand the process, because when we're budgeting, we require, or we follow very closely the fiscal notes. And under our rules, 4.10, it makes it very clear that a bill that would increase or decrease an appropriation has to go to Ways and Means unless it has basically an insignificant cost. And when you were chair before and when I was chair, we generally defined that as somewhere between $2,000 and $3,000. So any bill that would be above that number would go to Ways and Means. And so when I talked with you and I requested that this bill needed a fiscal note, what jumped out to me was the rulemaking part of it when I was reading it over. But there were other issues as well, because I've asked, and the one thing I do have the authority to do as a minority lead is request a local fiscal impact statement, which I have done, and that is in the process. So I'm a little bit concerned as we are here today that we will be discussing, one, the official fiscal note that should have been asked for, by the way, in K-12 finance, in my view, but unfortunately was not. But we will be moving a bill forward with my reading of it that has major impact on our local school districts financially without a local fiscal note before us. And I think in this particular case, with the new requirements on school districts, the new requirements on the Department of Ed, and the Board of Teaching, that a fiscal note was in order. And I'm interested in hearing what the department then does have to say, but I may, Mr. Chairman, have some additional questions. But I think it was important that people be reminded what the process is. And Bill Marks added to that. I've had conversations with Mr. Marks myself when a fiscal note would come back, and I'd have questions about it. And I would ask Mr. Marks through the other people in his department to maybe make future or increased contacts with the department, as he pointed out, to answer some of the basic questions. But I think the departments and our fiscal staff have been very professional when it comes to fiscal notes. And the same would be with revenue notes when we're dealing with tax-related issues. And both you and I are on the tax committee along with other members of this committee. And we rely very heavily on those revenue notes when we're looking at the cost of a piece of legislation there as well. That's how we balance the budget, members. And that's why a fiscal note here today in the bill before this committee was vitally important.
Well, and Representative Carlson, let me just say, and then I want to get to the testifier, and then we can go back to other questions. You know, I guess when you did come to me, you know, I originally, you know, I guess had heard about the bill. I looked at it. I didn't think there was a fiscal effect. We talked to our House fiscal analyst for this area. She didn't think there was a fiscal effect. I guess it was our opinion that we didn't need to ask for a fiscal note. And you know, as chair and probably all the other chairs, you know, we're certainly jealous of the prerogatives of our committee, and we don't want things going by our committee that we think ought to come to the committee. And if I genuinely thought there was a fiscal issue here, I would have asked for it. But when you came to me and asked for a fiscal note, I did then request one. You know, at this point, I certainly wish we had requested one earlier, because we would have maybe been able to work these things out and have reached an agreement. But we are where we are, and so the fiscal note is in front of us. I think it's legitimate to ask some questions about it and see just what sort of cost there is. And I guess let me just say that, I mean, if we, you know, when the bill leaves here today, I guess at the moment it's got an $895,000 fiscal cost, and, you know, presuming the committee passes it, we will count that in our budget until such time as maybe there is a revision with the department, or perhaps it's just included in the omnibus bill. But we certainly know that we need to pay attention to fiscal notes and the fiscal cost. That's what the committee's about. I guess I just legitimately had not thought that this bill had a fiscal cost. But with that, let me turn to the department, and I'm sorry, I know your first name is Britta, but I forget your last name.
That's fine. My name is Britta Rayton with MMB. I'm an executive budget coordinator. Liz Connor's supervisor. Liz was the executive budget officer that signed off on the note. One thing I just want to clarify, because I think, Mr. Chair, you had mentioned that MMB prepares the note, and that's really, the process is a little different than that. MMB receives a request for the note, and then the note is assigned to the agencies that are impacted. And so the actual preparation of the note happens at the agency. So the assumptions and the initial calculations that are included in the note were completed by the Department of Education and the Board of Teaching. So if the committee wishes to kind of dig into the assumptions and why costs were assumed where they were, I think the best place to have that conversation is probably with the Department of Education and the Board of Teaching, who I know are represented in the room today. The budget officer's role is to review the note when it's completed by the agencies and make sure that it conforms with our policies on fiscal notes and that the calculations make sense. I know the timeline was rather limited for this note in terms of the budget officer review. I believe Ms. Connor got the note late in the afternoon, the day before it was supposed to go to floor session. And when she received it back from the agencies, because Board of Teaching and the Department of Education do exist as somewhat separate entities, they had sent duplicate estimates of the cost. And so when I reviewed this with Ms. Connor, she mentioned that most of her time in review was spent kind of disentangling those costs and making sure nothing was double counted. So I think sometimes with shortened timelines, we don't have as much time to dig into the assumptions. I think Ms. Johnson's memo is helpful. MMB always encourages that if there are questions about the assumptions and the costs in a note, that we have open dialogue with the author or with other concerned legislators and fiscal staff to review the assumptions and make sure they make sense. I think this sounds like this is a place that's ripe to do that.
Well, Ms. Rayton, I do want to mention that I guess I don't know why the executive budget officer would have just gotten the request the day before session, because I made the request, I believe it was a week before that. And you may not know the answer to that, but I just want people to know that, and I don't regard that as an extraordinarily long period of time either, but we did make the request, I did make the request at Representative Carlson's urging. I want to say, I think it was Wednesday, 8 days before session. Ms. Rayton.
Yeah. Mr. Chair, if I may, I may have misspoke. The request was made on the timeline that you're indicating. I believe it was on the 19th that the request came to MMB. MMB then assigns the note out to the agencies, and they need time to evaluate the bill, have internal discussions about what the costs will be, and actually prepare the document. And then the document is sent back to the budget officer for review. So when I made the comment about Ms. Connor receiving it the day before the floor session, she received the final signed-off note from the agency the day before, and then needed to work with them to do some revisions in that one-day window. So the time available for MMB's review was that morning before the floor session was scheduled. The agencies did get the request, I believe, late in the afternoon on the 19th. But again, if there are specific questions about the assumptions, I think the Board of Teaching and MDE are probably best prepared to answer that.
Okay, and I do want to say, I mean, I don't regard, a week as a particularly long amount of time. There's a lot that goes into preparing a fiscal note. And I guess, I want to say that so that people here who may be in a position that they want to request one don't think that it's something that can easily come together in a couple of days. Well, I guess, Ms. Rayton, I guess if you don't want to respond, and I understand, given your situation as a supervisor, that you didn't, you're not the executive budget officer, and the executive budget officer is unavailable. I guess if you don't want to respond to Ms. Johnson, I don't know if there's someone from the department that wants to respond, or if we should just maybe go back to questions to Ms. Johnson. I guess we have someone from the department coming down? Okay, thank you, Ms. Rayton. Welcome to the Committee on Ways and Means. Could you introduce yourselves for the tape, please?
Yes, Mr. Chair and members, my name is Tom Melcher. I'm the Director of the School Finance Division at the Department of Education. And when the Department of Management and Budget assigns notes to the department, they do go to my division. So we received that fiscal note late in the afternoon on Thursday, the 19th. Normally, I think we're working with about an 8-day time frame to turn around fiscal notes, and we did get information from Mr. Marks that they did want to get this expedited as quickly as possible. Many times with fiscal notes, there are things that our division can do internally. If it's a change in a school funding formula, something like that, those go a little more quickly for us because it's within our division. This one was a little more complicated because it involves multiple divisions within the Department of Education and also working with the Board of Teaching. So by the time the communications go back and forth between the different agencies involved, we were looking at, it took us Friday and then Monday, Tuesday, and the better part of Wednesday. So it was 4 days for the department to go through the preliminary analysis of the fiscal note. I do have staff within my division that coordinate the process for the fiscal notes. If it's a fiscal note on a funding formula, we'll do the analysis ourselves. If it's a fiscal note on a topic like this, we have to rely on the expertise of the people in the programmatic area, and in this case, that involved the Board of Teaching and our licensing division within the department. So in terms of the substance of the note and the kind of the need for the rulemaking and the cost associated with some of the substantive changes, Ms. Doan is here from the Board of Teaching and would like to speak a little bit to the substance.
Okay, and again, Mr. Melcher, I do want to say, I'm not being critical about the amount of time that it took you to respond. I don't regard that as unreasonable. I guess I just, again, was surprised at the outcome of the analysis. But Ms. Doan, welcome to the Committee on Ways and Means.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Erin Doan. I'm the Executive Director of the Board of Teaching. I will take a couple of moments to respond to some of the things that came up initially, and then certainly happy to entertain other questions. To the first of the questions that Ms. Johnson proposed, while the board has rulemaking authority, certainly the board is bound by budgetary constraints when looking at any rulemaking initiative. So whether or not a rulemaking initiative is taken on or begins depends on whether there is funding available to move that forward. In this case, the board has not set aside funding for the type of rulemaking that is included in the bill, so there were costs that were assigned to that. Beyond that, I'll just mention it briefly, the licensure via portfolio system. Ms. Johnson's comments reflected that it began as a paper-based process, but did move to an online process in 2009, 2010. That was done with cooperation from MnSCU and the use of their eFolio system, which was free at that time. That has been discontinued at this point, and any further process would need to be recreated at this time. So you were seeing costs that were submitted by the agency to be redeveloping a system for submitting portfolios.
All right. Well, I think, and did you have any other response to any of the other things that Ms. Johnson had mentioned?
I mean, I will say this, Mr. Chair, representatives. I think last year, the board was without an executive director during the initial period of the initial timeframe for session. And some of the comments initially were to the point of, why didn't the board come forward with a request or a fiscal note for like bills in the past? And really, it was just a matter of not having someone at the table to be making sure that those concerns were adequately represented. For this year, the things that are involved in House File 2 do ask for some particular duties or responsibilities that we do not currently have staff available to do. So there were costs that were associated there. In addition, one thing that has been a high priority and there has been a lot of interest in is this establishment of interstate agreements. There is money that has been assigned as part of the fiscal note for the establishment of those interstate agreements. We are talking about agreements with 5 separate states, and certainly the need for some travel and communications to go along with that process.
Ms. Doan, did you testify at all on House File 2 when it was before the Education Committee or the Education Finance Committee?
I did, Mr. Chair, and while I did testify on certain financial implications, there were no exact numbers discussed at that time.
Okay. All right. Well, members, let me open things up for questions now. Representative Lincheski.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I just, I guess, I'm kind of just thinking about the process, so I guess my question is just for you. Did you make the request for that the House Fiscal Department massage and look through and, evaluate the fiscal note? Was that your request?
Representative Lincheski, no. I believe it was something that either House fiscal staff came forward with themselves, or I guess I don't know to what extent Representative Loon might have talked to them.
Okay, well, Mr. Chair, if I may.
Yes.
And I'm just looking at it, and, it's written to Chair Loon, and, that's not clear to me, and maybe she can tell us if she made the request or if it's written to her because she's the chief author. But my question really is for you, and, I've served on Ways and Means a long time, and I've served with you in the past, Mr. Chair, and I've been honored to be on the committee when you were the chair in the past. And while I'm certainly aware that both sides of the aisle will often question a fiscal note or a revenue estimate in tax committee and kind of go off and get somebody to give them the detail as to how something was arrived at, I do think it's quite uncommon for people to ask for, sort of an official memo on was the MMB analysis correct. So, I guess I'm trying to think of ever seen one of these before, quite frankly, and I'm sure they've existed, but I've asked a few people in the room if they've ever seen one, and they can't recall one. And I guess my question for you is, one, do you intend to do this on every fiscal analysis to sort of have the Minnesota House nonpartisan fiscal staff be another backstop to say, we're going to now analyze your analysis, and that's certainly your choice, or, and that's good, because the House members, all of us, get more information. So, it's a time value, trade-off, I would imagine. And if you do, will you afford the lead of this committee, lead Representative Carlson, the opportunity to, ask for these analyses as well? Because the thing that always happens in tax committee is both sides of the aisle tend to want to analyze the bills they don't like or do like, and not the rest of them. So it seems to me if we're going to do that, we should do this on every single bill, or not. So, if you could just comment on the process, just so I understand your thinking as the chair of this committee, how you want to look through these as they come forward.
Sure. Well, Representative Lincheski, no, it's not my intention to ask for something like this on every bill, and I certainly don't want anyone to think that we've in any way strong-armed the nonpartisan fiscal staff to give us this. This is, as you saw, addressed to Representative Loon. I did not specifically ask for this, although I certainly did go to Mr. Marks, and I think at one point had a conversation with Ms. Johnson in Representative Loon's office about, well, what do you think of this fiscal note? And partly because we had earlier on, when it became an issue, talked about it and had the impression that, at least it was my impression, perhaps it was wrong, it was my impression that fiscal staff didn't think that there was anything more than a negligible fiscal cost to House File 2. But I don't see this as something that's going to be something done in the normal course of business, no. Representative Lincheski.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, for explaining your thoughts on that, and certainly all bills become case by case, I understand that. And I, like you, have been in the situation where you think you're carrying a bill in an omnibus bill or a part of a bill, and a late fiscal note or revenue estimate comes in, and all of a sudden you need to make choices because things cost money that people didn't think cost money, because we all want these things to be free, but they're not. So I do appreciate your explanation. I was just trying to understand kind of how the committee will work going forward. So thank you very much.
Sure. Representative Detmer, then Carlson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This may be just a question for Mr. Marks or yourself. I've never chaired a finance committee, but again, it's the chair of the finance committee that requests the fiscal note. Now, the agencies, in this case, actually produce the fiscal cost, the fiscal note. Am I right? Can the agency then request a fiscal note?
Mr. Marks.
Mr. Chair, Representative Detmer, no, agencies cannot request a fiscal note. Agencies have an opportunity to present budget costs, for example, with the governor's budget recommendations. So if you think of governor's budget recommendations, that they're much like fiscal notes in the sense that governor's recommendations are all costed out in the governor's budget. So that's basically the executive branch's opportunity. But on a bill that's introduced that has no relation or is not in the governor's budget, agencies don't have that opportunity to formally request a fiscal note. They may very well go to the chair of the committee or the author of the bill or members and say, here's what we think it's going to cost, but not a formal fiscal note.
Thank you. Thank you.
Representative Carlson.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to ask the director of State Board of Teaching if she knows off the top of her head what her annual budget is, and maybe I'll just stop there and ask for a response on that.
Ms. Doan.
Mr. Chair, Representative, yes, our current annual allocation is set to go back to $618,000 for the next fiscal year. Last year, a one-year reprieve was given to appropriate an extra $100,000, boosting us up to $718,000, and we've asked for that again this year.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, of course, that's yet to be determined. That would be, an ask for the next biennium. That was the number I had, 618,000. And, Mr. Chairman, the reason I asked that question, when I first read the bill, as I mentioned, the thing that really jumped out at me initially, but other things did later with a more careful reading and then looking at the fiscal note, was the rulemaking part of this. And that would be, according to the fiscal note, almost 130,000, or probably roughly about 15% of your total budget. And I think people should understand the context of that if the amendment that's, I guess, not proposed yet, but if that were to go on and they were being asked basically to eat the cost of doing the rulemaking, would be taking a huge part of their annual budget. Thank you.
To that point, Ms. Doan, can you, the extra $100,000 you got last year, what was that for?
Mr. Chair, representatives, we had come to legislators last year based on state increases to salaries that happened over the last 2 years. The Board of Teaching not receiving an increase to its overall budget had basically ended up in operating deficit based on salaries and fringe benefits that were almost our complete operating budget. So there was an ask put forward last year to help us basically come out of the red and have a budget that was able to sustain the work that has been assigned.
Well, Ms. Doan, then, so at the top of page 2 on the memo by House Fiscal Staff, it says the Board of Teaching received $100,000 in one-time additional funding in 2014 to address costs associated with new teacher licensure testing requirements enacted last biennium. So do you not agree with that statement, then?
Mr. Chair, representatives, no, I don't agree with that statement. The money that was assigned last year, at least was in messaging, was not given for the purposes of testing.
Okay. Representative McNamara.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Doan, I'm trying to figure out, did you say that you actually testified in Education Committee and didn't bring up any thought about the fiscal implications of this bill when you testified earlier?
Ms. Doan.
Mr. Chair, Representative, yes, I did testify that there were fiscal implications, but no, we did not go down to this level. I also distributed a response to House File 2 to committee chairs prior to the start of session that gave not only our analysis of some of the pieces that were involved in the bill, but also addressed where there would be fiscal implication.
Representative McNamara.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Ms. Doan, I'm just trying to understand. So you did testify in committee and alluded that there would be, because if I understand right, this has got the implications of like 20% of your total budget. Is that correct? And it was not brought up in your testimony that these, I'm trying to envision in the landscape business, if you got something going on that affects 20% of your gross and you're testifying about the significant impact and it's not brought up in that context. I mean, it's one thing to have fiscal impact, as both the lead and the chair have talked about, $2,000-3,000. We sometimes say that's okay, but if it's 20% of your total budget, that seems like that should be an alarm to you in a major league way.
Ms. Doan.
Mr. Chair, Representative, yes, it is alarming. The other thing that I would like to point out, though, is that there are a number of expenses that are addressed in the bill and within the fiscal note that impact educator licensing. Because the Board of Teaching is responsible for the policy that governs the process of teacher licensing, the Board of Teaching does not actually implement that policy. That's implemented through educator licensing at the Department of Education. So many of the other costs that you're seeing represented within the fiscal note depend on systems to be able to implement the changes that are talked about here. So while the Board of Teaching definitely recognized that there are fiscal implications here, there are others involved to push that total up to $890,000 that are not the Board of Teaching's to defend.
Representative McNamara.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, Ms. Doan, I tend to worry about my area and worry about my area, and if other people got implications, I would agree with you. There might be other implications, but that's somebody else's issue. I'm just surprised that you actually testified in front of the Education Finance Committee. And was it clear in your testimony, again, I'm trying to understand, that this is something that had the impact of like 20% of your total budget, and the members on that committee didn't come across to understand that? Because I don't hear that was understood, that this is something that is six-figure implication for an agency that only has a six-figure budget totally. I'm a little surprised. I would think that there would have been some alarm in your testimony, in your voice, about the significant implications that would have eluded people to think, we need to take a deep breath here. Did your testimony go along those lines and to lead people that there was hundreds of thousands of dollars of implications here for an agency that budgets only under $1 million itself? I'm trying to understand, because I was surprised when you told me. I actually testified about the fiscal implication, and I'm trying to understand. So do you think your testimony was that there was significant implications in your testimony?
Ms. Doan?
Mr. Chair, Representative, at the time that I testified, I was not aware of the $123,000 figure that was assigned to the rulemaking. When a fiscal note is put together, there are numbers assigned to a small rulemaking initiative, medium rulemaking initiative, and large. At the time that the fiscal note was put together with support through the department, no, I was not aware that we were talking about a six-figure number when I gave testimony. When it was put together, that number was brought forward to me.
Thank you.
Okay, I've got Representative Anderson and then Representative Hillstrom. Representative Anderson.
I didn't know Representative Loon had a comment.
Oh, I'm sorry. I missed you, Representative Loon. Go ahead to that point.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I just would like to point out that during the Education Finance hearing on House File 2, because I was sitting at the testifier table, actually Representative Crecia was chairing the hearing, he repeatedly asked for anyone with fiscal concerns about the bill to come forward. Neither Ms. Doan or anyone from the department took the opportunity to come down and offer testimony on fiscal concerns at that time, nor did anyone else who came to testify. So, you know, I do take some issue with that. There was testimony from the Board of Teaching around concerns over our teacher standards and licensing, references to basically our high standards in Minnesota, but really no pointed testimony of any kind regarding fiscal concerns.
Representative Anderson.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I apologize, I didn't catch your name from
Doan. Erin
Doan.
Doan.
Ms. Doan. You know, a lot of what we do on the fiscal side of issues is having some continuity and rely on our fiscal analysts to be able to provide that insight on continuity of what we can expect when bills get put forward. Hence the reason that a lot of times the fiscal analysts will say this bill doesn't need a fiscal note because of what history has told us. And I'm just kind of puzzled because I just did a quick perusal of the bills from 2013, 2014 related to education, and there's several different bills that required new chores, tasks for the Board of Teaching, one that had a window of reporting back to school districts within 2 days, another one that expanded what their overall scope is for responsibilities, and yet neither of those two bills that I found just quickly, neither of those had a fiscal note attached to them, and I'm just wondering how, you know, what is your process so that we have a better idea from a fiscal note standard of what we can expect, because those look pretty similar to what Representative Loon is proposing here today in the requirements that she's asking from the Board of Teaching, and yet those did not have a fiscal note attached to them at all, and they were passed into law.
Ms. Doan.
Mr. Chair, Representative, as I spoke to before, during the last session especially, we were without an executive director. I had stepped in at the last minute to fill an interim role, but we did not have appropriate, what I would consider as appropriate representation during the last session until very late in the game. At this point, I think it's also important to note that the Board of Teaching really at this point is only a little less than 6 positions. And so certainly much of the work we do relies on support from the Department of Education. And I say that not to put them into the limelight as to a place to point blame, but to say that certainly they rely on us to be in communication with them as we do rely on them. as far as, fiscal notes that were not referred to the board during that time, I don't have an answer for you as to why there were not questions about the fiscal impact of those things during the last session.
One more question, Representative
And
Anderson?
just quickly, Mr. Chair, and Ms. Doan, so then what were the fiscal impacts from not having an executive director in place? What kind of fiscal impact did you experience from the 2013-2014 session that now you're having to make up for? And can you itemize what those would be? You don't have to do it now, but I'd like to kind of get an idea of what those were and how how the board is handling those additional costs that you say occurred. And I think it would be helpful to know which bills they came from. That would be great.
Ms. Dawn, if you could get back to us on that then after the meeting sometime.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll do that.
Thank you. I've got Representative Hillstrom.
Thank you. Ms. Doan, I'm not sure if you're the one to answer the questions about the actual adjoining states' teacher licensure. So there's a process put forward in this bill that says that that you should enter into some interstate agreements for teacher licensures that are similar with the rigor of Minnesota's teachers' licensure requirements. Can you tell me, does that mean that the teachers from adjoining states have to pass the similar background checks as well? Because Minnesota is much more rigorous than many other states in terms of disqualifiers for people who have been convicted of certain kinds of crimes. So would that be included in these requirements in this bill?
Ms. Doan.
Mr. Chair, Representative, yes, background checks continue to be a part of the process. The interstate agreements, we've already begun working on an interstate agreement with Wisconsin, and much of the agreement really addresses being able to draw equivalencies between their licensure expectations and ours, but certainly any of the fingerprinting process or background checks would still remain in place regardless of the state that we're signing agreements with.
Representative Hillstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we would keep Minnesota's standard for those background checks rather than Wisconsin's standard for those background checks.
Ms. Doan.
Mr. Chair, Representative, that's correct. We would keep our own standard for background checks.
Mr. Chair.
Representative Hillstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This bill also requires an expedited process for teachers from outside the state. Does that have any implication on the process for teachers that want to become licensed from inside the state? I want to make sure that this bill doesn't make it easier to become a teacher if you live somewhere else than it does to become a teacher if you're actually from Minnesota.
Ms. Doan.
Mr. Chair, Representative, as to what that process looks like, I can't really tell you whether or not it's going to make it easier or not easier. What I would say is that if we do expedite specifically applications that come from those trained in other states, yes, that would have an impact on even processing time for those who are being recommended in state. As we're talking about finances, I want to make sure that I'm kind of sticking to that piece. There will be changes needed to our system to be able to address some of the changes.
Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair.
Okay, last question, Representative Hillstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So what I think I just heard you say is that because we're going to expedite outside of the state teachers, that it actually may increase the time for people that actually are from Minnesota to become teachers.
Ms. Doan.
Mr. Chair, Representative, if that in fact was the outcome of the bill, that we specifically expedited applications for those trained from out of state, yes, it would have impacts on those who are being recommended for licensure within state, primarily because we're still talking about having 4 people that are processing all the licenses within the state of Minnesota.
All right, I have Representative Dean, Albright, Wagenius, and Carlson. And again, members, we're planning on finishing debate at 11 o'clock. Representative Dean.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Ms. Doan. I just have a quick question, not knowing a lot about your board and how it works, but I would imagine that you process the licenses for all licensed teachers in the state of Minnesota. Is that correct, Ms. Doan?
Ms. Doan.
Mr. Chair, Representative, educator licensing at the Department of Education does process all of the applications for licensure.
And,
Representative Dean.
and Mr. Chair and Ms. Doan, are you aware of what the annual revenue from what we charge all the teachers in the state of Minnesota to pay their license fees currently is?
Ms. Doan.
Mr. Chair, Representative, I am not aware of that number off the top of my head, no.
Thank you.
Representative Albright.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Doan, In conversation, in response to a question just earlier, you mentioned about the absence of an executive director for some portion of time during the last biennium. But I'm conflicted by the fact that when you are requested to respond to or identify issues that you have of a fiscal nature, you're actually not in a position to per se bring those forward, other than it needs to come to you in a request from MB that is requested through the chair of a fiscal committee. So to the extent that your capacity to respond to those is diminished by the lack of an executive director, I'm having a hard time appreciating the fact that you wouldn't be able to respond in a normal fashion, given the fact that your staff probably takes care of that anyway. So could you respond to that a little bit?
Ms. Doan?
Mr. Chair, Representative Albright, no, there isn't a staff member that takes care of that for the Board of Teaching. But to my earlier point was really, requests don't come directly to the Board of Teaching. They come to the Department of Education and then are referred to the Board of Teaching when there's something that impacts them. If requests were being received at the Board of Teaching during that, or at the Department of Education during that time, they were not being forwarded to a member of the Board of Teaching or their staff for comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Wagenius?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is for the author. Representative Loon, the earlier conversations about this bill have centered around teacher layoffs in a time of surplus. And now we're talking about attracting needed teachers with different standards. So my basic question here is, since this is a time of surplus, will you be proposing in your big bill to pay competitive wages as a way to solve the problem of attracting teachers in areas we don't have them?
Representative Loon?
Mr. Chair and Representative Wagenius, well, certainly as we look to put together the omnibus bill for financing our schools, certainly what we're able to provide to schools is something that we're going to be looking carefully at. I think with a surplus, I'm encouraged that, that it will be a top priority for us, as well as there have been pieces of legislation introduced. We have not heard them yet in committee, but I'm hoping to, that would offer, whether it's student loan forgiveness or other programs to encourage people into the field of teaching, specifically to address some of the shortages that we have, whether if it's in particular types of licensure or in certain parts of the state that are experiencing difficulty attracting teacher candidates.
Representative Wagenius?
But that wasn't my question. My question really is about not loan forgiveness or alternative standards, but competitive salaries, competitive wages. I mean, that's the way business operates. When it has a shortage, it will pay competitive wages. We do that where we're, well, we do that too. So in the area of teaching where we have shortages, I want to know if we're going to be addressing that problem, and that's a real one, with competitive wages.
Representative Loon?
Mr. Chair and Representative Wagenius, as well, to the degree we are able to, that is certainly something we're looking at. Again, we don't generally determine the pay scale for teachers. That's something that's done within individual districts and according to the agreements that they have with their teachers. But again, I do see that because we're having difficulty attracting people into the field of teaching, specifically in some of the sciences and STEM areas, special education's a continued growing need, as well as getting teachers who will go to some more remote and rural areas of the state. Those are all things that we will be looking at.
Okay, Representative Wagenius, last question.
Yes, it's just more of a comment. I appreciate, particularly in the areas of science and math, which I am very worried about, that we have great teachers if we are expecting to have great business opportunities. So I'm glad you're going to be looking at that. Thank you.
Representative Carlson?
We've moved beyond where I had a follow-up to Representative Hillstrom, but I'll wait until later.
All right, well, thank you. Representative Hillstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So Representative Loon, so based on the testimony, I'm going to kind of make my final statement here as well as asking a question because I'm not sure it'll get back to me if we're going to end at 11 o'clock. But you've testified that the goal was to come up with a new process and that all of the evaluations up to this point have been collaborative efforts. Question one, don't you believe that by actually going to this process that you're going to stop that collaborative process and make teachers now competing with one another rather than working together for the best interest of the students because there's going to be some other measure by which they're going to be terminated because that's really what this is about, teacher layoffs. The second question is, you talked about mentors and coaches. What incentive will a teacher have to be a mentor or a coach if the very person that they're mentoring or coaching is going to be coming after their job based on performance? The final question that I have is, why in the world, based on our education standards in higher education, would you want to do an expedited process for people who are out of state and not an expedited process for people who actually graduate from Minnesota schools? I think you've got that all wrong.
Representative Loon, would you like to respond?
Yes, I would, Mr. Chair. Thank you. First, Representative Hillstrom, the bill does not provide for an expedited process for out-of-state licensure. It directs the Board of Teaching, and actually this directive was provided to them in 2011. This is not new directive to the board. This is 4 years ago. The directive to come up with a clear and transparent process for teachers who are licensed in other states of what they need to do to become licensed in Minnesota. We heard ample testimony before Education Policy and Education Finance Committee of instances where their teacher candidates are directed to call, if they call the Department of Education Licensing Division, they didn't get a clear picture, they called Board of Teaching, and then were in fact directed to call an Institute of Higher Learning to figure out what it is they needed to do to obtain licensure. So they were directed to come up with a clear process. Doesn't mean that it's quicker or faster or easier. We are not changing the rigor of our standards, but just that there should be a process that is spelled out, clearly understood by candidates what they need to do to become licensed. What are we asking? And honestly, we've had candidates who have gone and gotten to the point of perhaps initiating legal action only then to have their applications approved. By not having something clearly detailed, such as in rules, I frankly feel that the state is open to a legal action for having this be perhaps somewhat capricious or arbitrary. Clearly, there is some kind of criteria or rubric that the board or the licensing division is looking at, but it's just not, it's not evident, and it's not out there for the public and teacher candidates to see. So that is answer to that. And with regards to concerns about teachers no longer collaborating, working together, I mean, no, I do not have that concern. And it's because teachers I hold in very high esteem. They are a professional people. They have a very important job. And I don't believe that teachers would sort of treat each other in such a way that would be detrimental to the students that they're have in their charge, that they are dedicated to making sure they're doing the best possible work in educating those students. And I think that their efforts to work collaboratively to accomplish that goal would continue.
All right, seeing no further discussion, Representative Loon renews her motion that House File 2 be referred to the General Register as amended. All in favor, say aye.
Mr. Chair.
Aye.
Opposed?
No.
Motion prevails. The bill is passed. I'm sorry, Representative Carlson.
It was just the one amendment then that was adopted. I just want to make that
Yes, we
clear.
just
You didn't-
adopted the one amendment. We did not take
You
up
did
the
not move the
856
other amendment. That's
Yep.
what I was going to ask about.
Okay.
Okay, very good.
Yeah,
Thank you.
sorry, we were in the middle of the vote, and I didn't want to, I know I'm not supposed to interrupt that. But yeah, no, the A56 amendment was not taken up, and it was not adopted. It was only the amendment that took out the two little items relating to Chapter 13.
Okay, very good, thank you.
Okay, and what I'd like to do, members, this has been a good discussion on the whole fiscal note process, and, I guess, obviously, at this point, we wish we had asked for a fiscal note earlier on this. I genuinely did not think that we had fiscal effects. I guess I'd like to direct our fiscal staff to continue to talk to MMB and the Board of Teaching and the Department of Education on the fiscal note to see if there are some revisions that need to be made to this fiscal note. And I guess if, we'll see what comes back on that. If nothing comes back and the fiscal note stands as it is, this is certainly money that we will then book toward this bill. Any questions on that from anyone? The division, I should
Mr.
say.
Chairman,
book it.
one thing that I think much of this could have been avoided, and maybe if you could put out a memo, or perhaps the speaker, when a bill like this or any bill is before the fiscal committees, and I don't want to compare one chair with another, but I used to insist, and one of the more difficult ones I had to deal with, as Mr. Marks knows, was Health and Human Services because of the complexity of the bill. But I would insist that there be a fiscal note before that left the Health and Human Services Committee, even if it meant at times, in fact, I remember one year in particular, it was the last bill out, simply because we were waiting for fiscal notes. And I'm not being critical of the department in that case, it's just a very complex bill, but perhaps a memo to, I think Representative Loon, had you requested a fiscal note when this was before your Finance Committee, much of the discussion here today about process would have been avoided.
Yeah, and I think Representative Carlson, that's probably good advice. I mean, and I've already talked to some of our chairs about that. Another factor here, however, that I guess needs to be mentioned is that when it came to the Education Finance Committee, it's my understanding that there were some fiscal effects in the bill that were then amended out. And so I think part of the feeling was that whatever fiscal effects there were that meant it had to come to the Finance Committee originally, once they were amended out, was assumed that then there weren't any costs, and then it was okay not coming here. Representative Carlson.
Yeah, I had, Mr. Chairman, just so there's an understanding on this point, a conversation, I'll just say with one of the key players on your caucus on education, and the position was that, well, this bill saved money in that person's view, and therefore it didn't need to come to Ways and Means. And I think the fiscal chairs have to understand that you have to book it, whether it's a savings or a cost, and that probably was just clearly a misunderstanding on the part of someone involved on the policy side. But, unless it's negligible, as you pointed out, any bill with a savings or a cost should come here so that you can appropriately book it. So I appreciate the hearing today, and I appreciate your being willing to ask for the fiscal note when I made the request. Thank you.
Sure, and Representative Carlson, you're right, and I think it's a good thing to reaffirm to people that even if a bill saves money, that's a fiscal item too. And so unless it's a really negligible amount, it is then something that should come to Ways and Means.
And perhaps, Mr. Chairman, how are you going to define negligible? That's probably, we went back and forth between 2,000 and 3,000, and I think it was one of those numbers when you were chair before. But how will we be defining that? That might be helpful to people as well.
Well, on that, I guess there isn't a specific answer, and this is why. I mean, if someone has a bill that actually says the XYZ Finance Committee appropriates $1,000 to some item, I mean, if there's actually an appropriation line that says $1,000, even though I'd otherwise say that's a negligible amount, that $1,000, which is a specific appropriation, does have to come to Ways and Means so that we can book that item. On the other hand, if you look at the bill and there's no specific appropriation, and, I thought it was going to cost $1,000, but there was no specific appropriation to it, well, then I guess I'd say that was negligible. And I guess in my mind, the amount would be something in the order of a few $1,000s. I think years ago we said that the cost of a constitutional amendment was a couple $1,000s, and yet that was enough to say that a constitutional amendment should come before the Ways and Means Committee. So it's not a particularly large amount of money.
I had a pretty tight definition, Mr. Chairman, and I think we're in basic agreement
Sounds like we are.
that they should come here if they are anything above, however you choose to define negligible. Thank you.
Representative Liebling, did you have a question?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just really wanted to make a comment. You know, I've been listening, trying to follow all the back and forth about how the fiscal note came in late and all the things around that. And, you know, being new on the Ways and Means Committee, I'm kind of just learning about this whole process. But I just wanted to say that when we were on the floor, being new to this process, I thought I heard at least the implication was made that this fiscal note came in late and that there was some kind of suspicion that this was the administration kind of trying to scuttle the bill by now, very late in the game, putting a price tag on it. And I have understood today that the administration really only had, about 7 days, I think 7, 8 days to do the fiscal note, that it was requested late. I'm understanding why it was requested late. I don't think we need to go through that, but I do think we kind of owe an apology to the administration, to the gal from the Board of Teaching here explaining her role, and MMB, because they did absolutely nothing wrong. They took the request, they worked as fast as they could to get the thing out, and, you know, agree or disagree with their numbers, they certainly acted in good faith to do what they were supposed to do. And so, you know, I think we're all kind of things are kind of settling down here. Everybody sort of understands where everybody was coming from, and that's all fine. But I just don't want to kind of leave them holding the bag, because what I understood on the floor, coming at this as really a newcomer, was that they were being blamed for something. And I certainly think that from today's hearing that that's not the case. But I think that really needs to be clear that, you know, I am, you know, often actually very pleased and amazed at how well our government really does work. And to see people kind of get in gear and do this really quickly upon being requested, I think we owe them some thanks and perhaps an apology for the implication that they had done something wrong.
Well, Representative Liebling, I guess I would say, as I've already said, that I didn't think that it was particularly late in terms of the fiscal note, although if there was going to be a cost, it would have been nice if we got it more than 2 hours before it showed up on the floor, or was to come on the floor. I guess in regard to the note itself, I guess I just refer you to the memo that came out from nonpartisan fiscal staff, where I guess it was their view, and again, our view, that there wasn't any cost to this. And, you know, to me, we require agencies to do rulemaking and absorb other costs all the time with the salaried state staff that they have and the appropriations that they have. And obviously, at some point, you can be unreasonable and ask someone to do something that just can't be done. And at that point, certainly there would be additional fiscal costs. I guess I didn't think, and I don't think our nonpartisan fiscal staff thought that this was the case. And we didn't hear any claims, apparently, in the Education Finance Committee when there was earlier testimony that that was the case. And so I guess I don't know that I think an apology is in order, but I guess I do think and expect that our nonpartisan fiscal staff will be talking with MMB and the Board of Teaching and the Department of Education to see if they can come to more of an agreement on what fiscal costs, if any, there should be. And perhaps we'll get a revised fiscal note back. Perhaps we won't. And if we don't, you know, that's the department continuing to make their claim. But we didn't have as much time as obviously would have been optimum here. And if we had had it a few weeks earlier, this sort of discussion between everyone would have happened earlier, and we wouldn't have been in the situation that we're in. And so in the future, I guess we do want to just make sure that we request fiscal notes on time. And I guess if there's any question at all, I guess make sure to request them, even though, again, based on custom and usage and what we were being advised, we didn't think there was any fiscal cost here. Representative Davids.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If there's going to be any committee apology, I'd like to be excluded from that.
All right. And I guess, you know, at the same time, you know, The committee administrator reminds me that we, of course, have over 1,000 bills that have now been introduced, and obviously, we also want to be considerate of just how much work we're trying to give to all of our state employees who are required to put together those notes. And if we asked for a fiscal note on every single bill, they'd be overwhelmed too. And so it's a bit of a balancing act. But I think at this point, the bill has been passed. If there are fiscal costs, like I said, we'll certainly assign them to the committee, and we'll move on to the next item of business. Representative Davids.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't think the bill was passed. I think it was referred to the floor. Isn't that correct?
Excuse me.
I got sued on that, too, so-
Senior Chairman Davids.
Just a thought.
The bill has been referred to the floor.